Okay. So we spent a long time last week going over 7.4, Mishnah Sanhedrin 7.4, because we needed to know more about these whole who was going to be responsible for being for stoning. And one of the categories that was mentioned were people who blaspheme. And blaspheme is a great English word, like we were just talking about before we began recording, that is used rather loosely in the general population, but has a very technical definition when it comes to legal issues. And just think for a second, if you are going to execute somebody for blasphemy, then you really need to know what blasphemy looks like or sounds like, because this person's life will end. And that means blasphemy, as you'll see, is not just they said something that was unflattering about religion, or they said something that made me feel uncomfortable. It's a very specific act that, as we'll see, has very specific requirements for the testimony. Okay, so we're on chapter 7, number 5, blasphemy. Anyone interested in reading?
We will split.
Take turns.
I'll start. The blasphemer is punished only if he utters the divine name.
All right, so Hashem. Hashem meaning the literal, actual divine name, God's name. If you don't say God's name, you have not committed blasphemy legally. You may have still been rude. You may have still been saying something that was insulting. You may still be absolutely wrong and in need of a attitude adjustment, I think is the vernacular, but you have not committed blasphemy. You have not broken that commandment, and even if witnessed and warned and all the other things we've talked about, you would not be subject to the death penalty for having done so. And
so it's only for that word?
Only for that word. And that word, we don't have the pronunciation for now.
Yeah.
And very, very important, they are speaking specifically about the Hebrew name of God, right? So someone can, in quotes, take God's name in vain all they want, as far as the technical concern, in English, and there is no legal repercussion. As I said, it's still wrong, it still needs an attitude adjustment, et cetera, but they are not violating the commandment, and they are not liable for the death penalty. One of the reasons, by the way, that always bugs me when people get very uptight about writing G-O-D, and they throw in hyphens or exclamation points or some other nonsense. English is not a holy language. I like Shakespeare. I love English. I think it is a great language. It is not our holy language, and G-O-D is not God's holy name. And putting sanctity on it to the point that we then protect it distracts us from the fact and the uniqueness of God's actual name. So no hyphens needed, and you can do what you like with the English letters G-O-D. Part 2.
Rabbi Joshua Korcha said, the whole day of the trial, the witnesses are examined by means of a substitute for the divine name.
For example,
I'm sorry,
Yossi.
My eyes are playing Yosemite. May Yossi smite Yossi.
Okay, so Yossi here is a substitute for God's actual Hebrew name. And what they mean is, in order to have a trial, you need to have witnesses give testimony. And in order for witnesses to give testimony in a blasphemy trial, what's the problem?
You can't repeat what was said.
Exactly. If you repeat what was said, you've committed blasphemy. So it's a catch-22. And the rabbis have thought of this, of course, and they say, yes, during the whole trial, we use a substitute. So you just use a substitute name, and every time they say that name, everyone knows what they mean is, in this name, the guy who's on trial said God's name. And that way they can still describe exactly what they heard, where they were standing when they heard it, and all of that, without themselves committing an act of blasphemy. Clear? Onward.
When the trial was finished, the accused was not executed on this evidence, but all persons were removed from court, and the chief witness was told, state literally what you heard.
Go ahead and keep reading, and we'll...
Thereupon he did so, using the divine name. The judges then arose and tore their garments, which were not to be resewn.
And go ahead and finish it off.
The second witness stated, I too have heard this, but not uttering the divine name. And the third says, I too heard thus.
Okay. So as much as we do not want to repeat the blasphemy, we also do not want to execute somebody without absolutely confirming precisely what they heard him say. And so although they may use the euphemism throughout the whole trial, when it comes time to make a conviction, right, when everybody is very, very clear that this is going to be a conviction, if in fact it really was the divine name, they clear the room so as few people as possible will hear God's name spoken thusly. And then they have the chief witness say exactly what he heard, including God's name. The judges rend their garments. That was always a sign of mourning and of tragedy. There are different rules for how you re-sew a torn garment that was torn for mourning. And in this case, it is not re-sewn. It would have been just simply tacked over, and you would have kept a tear in your garment in perpetuity for having the unfortunate case of having been there when someone uttered such blasphemy and needed to be executed because of it. And then the other witnesses can just say, ditto. Yes, that's what I heard, in order that we not excessively repeat it. It's a neat and tidy compromise between we want to execute someone if they truly did commit the crime, but we don't want to execute someone without having heard precisely what they did. So we'll split the difference.
Yeah.
Questions? Comments? Uncomfortable with the idea of blasphemy as being a punishable offense? So,
Yeah, I'm trying to reconcile it with freedom of speech, but that was not one of the principles that really drove them.
freedom of argumentation, absolutely. We're going to see about cursing elders and such later. But the flip side of freedom of speech that Judaism has always held very strongly is that words matter. That although you are free, because you have free will, to say what you like, the words you utter have weight, they have consequences, and they have impact. If you say certain words to a certain person, you're married. If you say certain words to another person, you're not married. If you say certain words, you have purchased something. If you don't say those words, even if the person thinks you're going to purchase it, you haven't purchased it, right? What you say really does matter. And therefore, you're free to say whatever you like, but you're also free to suffer the consequences. Someone else? Or?
No.
Okay, so the other side that we need to understand of why God's name is so important, because again, we're not talking about generic blasphemy laws like you found throughout Christian Europe for many, many centuries, where you could be accused of blasphemy if you said anything that someone didn't like. We will get down to correct thinking much later, in chapter 10 of Sanhedrin. That's a much more controversial and interesting section. But this is the technical what comes out of your mouth issue. God's name is more than just a religious taboo. God's name in Judaism is a statement of God's essence and a statement of the fundamental nature of the world. To use it as a curse, to use it as a way of inflicting pain upon others, or to negate itself, is essentially to be a nihilist. You are negating all of reality, all of goodness, all of everything, according to the Jewish idea. That's because God's name encompasses all of that. The name that they're talking about, the Yud He Vav He, is the very name that is built around the idea of God's essential existence and the outflowing from God's existence of the entire world. So they weren't just being stodgy when it came to saying God's name. They were saying anybody who is using God's name in this manner is essentially an enemy of all of existence and reality. So it may still make us uncomfortable because we are raised with this idea of freedom of speech, but for them and for those who think of God's name in that way, it is absolutely the equivalent of yelling fire in a crowded theater. You are essentially calling for the destruction of all of reality. And that makes us uncomfortable. As we cannot pronounce that name, we do not know the correct pronunciation in the modern world, this is no longer a law that we are concerned with. We still want people to speak of God respectfully and to think of God well, but the specific issue of blasphemy is no longer a operating legal restriction. There are still limits on how you treat God's written name, but that's a different issue. That's not one of blasphemy. That's one, the packet one. There, staple, yeah, the big thick one. That's it. Chapter 7, Mishnah 6 is where we just got to. So now that we've said what you can't say about God, very narrowly construed, but very strictly punished, what about this whole idea of idol worship? What counts as idol worship? So that's where we are now on chapter 7 and Mishnah 6. So are we playing around the room?
Yeah.
You're going to go? Okay.
Yeah. He who engages in idol worship is executed.
Cut and dry, right? We can all go home. What counts as idol worship?
This includes the one who serves it, sacrifices, offers incense, makes libations.
Now, libations are liquid sacrifices. Yeah, it's like wine or oil or water. Fancy English word.
Bows to it, accepts it as a god, or says to it, "You are my God."
Okay, so if you look at part 2, we're going to see that not everything you do with an idol counts as idol worship. So go ahead and read part 2, and then we'll begin to talk about what's the difference.
Part 2. But he who embraces, kisses it, sweeps or sprinkles the ground before it, washes it, anoints it, clothes it, or puts shoes on it, he transgresses a negative commandment, but is not executed.
All right. So what's the difference between part 1 and part 2? Why is the first half executable and the second half not?
Maybe because the first actions were actions that were made actually in the temple.
Kind of.
Kind of.
What took place in the temple?
Sacrifices.
No. I mean, what was the general idea of what we were doing in there? What did we call?
Praying.
What?
Praying, worship.
What?
Worship.
Worship. Okay? And that's what the rabbis are drawing a distinction of. Idol worship is a capital crime. Idol affiliation is a negative commandment. You definitely should not be doing this, but it is not a capital crime, right? Because what happens when you worship the idol? What are you making as a statement of theology, of belief, of practice when you do that?
You're turning it to another god before you.
Exactly. You're turning it into a god, which is the negation of our God. Right? The whole idea of God is that there is only one God for the entire world, and that God has no physical form, because to have a physical form would not be the God that we know of as God, regardless of whatever form you put it on, which is why the golden calf was prohibited, even though the people said this was our God. You can't put God in a shape. It just doesn't work. You don't understand God. You're negating God by doing that in and of itself. When you worship then an idol, it is not just a bad idea. It is an absolute counter to God in God's self. And that's why that is such a high level. But it has to be worshipful. It has to be showing it true reverence and divinity. Whereas the other things, you're consorting with idols, but you're not necessarily worshiping them, and therefore you're not necessarily fundamentally rejecting God. And so it's still not a good idea, but there are lots of things that aren't good ideas. We don't execute people for all of them. So you could think of it a little bit as the difference of when you eat a ham sandwich, you're also failing to follow one of the commandments. But in the eating of that ham sandwich, you're not negating the very essence of God. You're breaking one of the commandments God gave us, but it's not saying everything about God is completely wrong and I'm going to go do this. It's just, I want to have a ham sandwich. Same thing here with idol worship. Doing these other things, they are of a lesser degree as opposed to the straight up worship. And they list exactly what worship means, again, to avoid confusion between what is and what isn't. And if we go on, we'll see that that can be a little tricky.
Number 3, he who vows or swears by its name violates a negative commandment.
Right? So if you make an oath, I solemnly swear by insert name of idol here, you're not worshiping the idol, but you are definitely breaking a commandment. So therefore, you're not executed, but you are reprimanded, shall we say. Onward.
Number 4, he who uncovers himself before Baal Peor is guilty and is to be stoned for. This is how it is worship.
So coincidentally, the section of the Torah that we're reading this week has to do with Baal Peor and the whole Moabite. I almost said Bacchanal, but that's a different god. The Moabite women show up and they entice the men of Israel into worshiping, in quotes, this god, which, as you can piece together between this and the story of the enticement, involves a certain amount of intimacy. That was a means of their worship. So therefore, even though exposing yourself before other idols was considered, as it would be in the synagogue, not a good thing to do and disrespectful, when it came to this god, exposing yourself was precisely how you worshipped, and therefore doing that for that god was considered an act of worship, and you would be liable for execution. In the same way, part 5.
5, he who casts a stone on Malkulis is guilty and is to be stoned for. This is how it is worshipped.
So apparently this is another name for the god of Mercury, and they used rocks in their worship ceremonies. And therefore, if you're putting rocks out in front of this idol, you're not just moving stones, you are worshiping, and therefore you are involved. Which means, by the way, as we'll see, if you are going to be a judge, you kind of have to know how idol worship works. Right? Because you have to know that when someone comes and says, I saw so-and-so in front of this statue, and he was, opening up his tunic, you have to know whether or not that meant he was being disrespectful or whether he was engaging in worship. The fun of being a judge in the ancient world. Questions? Make sense? Okay. Mishnah 7:7 is going to deal with a different form of worship and of other prohibited practices. 7:7. Are we bouncing the ball back?
I'll read.
Okay.
Do we get?
Or Laura, you can go around.
You want?
Sure.
They were taking turns, and then you came, so we don't want to hold you accountable to their agreement, but we also don't want to leave you out.
Okay, I'll read.
Okay, so 7:7.
I'm just starting with Mishnah 7, number 1.
Right.
So he who gives of his seed to Molech is not liable unless he delivers it to Molech and causes it to pass through the fire.
All right, so Molech was another ancient god, and mentioned specifically in the Torah, as well as other ancient literature, as being a god that people would take their children and sacrifice to Molech by casting them into the fire. That was the way of worshiping. And what they're saying here is, in order to be guilty of that specific transgression, which is singled out within the Torah. Idol worship as a whole is mentioned, but this particular act is singled out as a special case of idol worship to be prohibited. You only trip the special Molech clause if you both bring your child to Molech and put them through the fire. And there's some debate in the among modern scholars of whether putting your child through the fires of Molech meant actually incinerating them. It clearly meant that in some cases, but there may have been a junior version where you would pass the child through the fire of Molech, much like a baptism through the fire. Still very unpleasant, still very not nice, but as anybody who's ever waved their hand through the flame of a candle knows, if you're moving quickly enough, it's not deadly to pass through the area of fire. Still prohibited.
If he gave it to Molech but did not cause it to pass through the fire, or he caused it to pass through the fire but did not give it to Molech, he incurs no penalty. unless he delivers it to Molech and causes it to pass through the fire.
All right, so we got to have both conditions to be met. Now we're going to change to a slightly different topic. And thankfully, the translator here, we were talking about this before you came, the translator here didn't bother translating. And you'll see why in just a minute.
A Baal Og is the Pitom who speaks from his armpit.
Right? Good. Go ahead and read the next one too.
The Yideoni is one who speaks from his mouth. These two are stoned, while he who inquires of them transgresses a formal prohibition.
All right, so the reason why these are not translated is because we're not 100% sure what the modern English word would be for these. We're not even 100% sure what exactly they did in the ancient world, but these are essentially forms of soothsayers, of people who were necromantic fortune tellers, or people who communed with the dead to give information. And they had different techniques for doing this. According to one tradition, the first would, the armpit would put the skull under the armpit, and the skull would talk and would tell the whatever. And the other guy would commune with the dead, but he was the person who would do it. Much like, the modern channeling type people, seances and whatnot. So this is trying to say both of those are prohibited. And the people who do them, the people who engage in the activity of communicating with the dead, they are liable to the death penalty. The people who ask them to do so, to ask the questions and all of that, they are they transgress, but they're not necessarily executed. Make sense? Maybe?
What does Og mean?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
We don't know.
No. I mean, it's kind of like...
I said it wrong. I said Pitom, like the Hebrew, but maybe that's Pithom?
Well, the idea is that it's likely taken from the Greek.
So that it's probably Pithom.
Maybe. Or maybe it's the Hebrewisation of a Greek word, and the original Greek word might be something different. So we have a number of Hebrew words that came from Greek that got turned into Hebrew words rather than the original Greek form, much like English takes foreign words all the time and just forces them through the meat grinder of English pronunciation. So we really... I'm sure that there are wonderful academic papers written about what these probably were and the whole linguistic chain of how it would have gotten from one to the other. That's above my pay grade. And the basic idea, of course, is that A, we don't consult with the dead, and B, those who are consulting with the dead, as in the performer, are the ones who are most in trouble. Those who come asking questions are wrong, but are to a lesser degree in trouble. All right, we're really moving along now.
He who desecrates the Sabbath is stoned, providing that it is an offense punished by karet.
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 That should be a good T sound, yeah.
Okay. If deliberate, and by a sin offering, if unwitting.
Okay. A little confusing. Let me see if I can explain a bit here. So, as I'm sure you're aware, there are prohibitions on what we can do on Shabbat. Right? I'm not going to take and write on Shabbat. Right? Doing this on Wednesday night, no problem. Doing this Saturday morning, I have transgressed. But the Torah itself and the rabbis by extension make a distinction between doing something on Shabbat you're not supposed to do, unwittingly, and deliberately with warning. So the deliberately means you know that it's Shabbat, you know that it is wrong, and you know that the penalty is what it is. If there are no witnesses, you are punished by karet. Karet, as we've mentioned before, means that God will take care of your untimely demise. Your spirit is cut off, is the sort of literal idea. Karet means literally to be cut. So if you do it unwittingly, meaning you didn't know it was Shabbat, or you didn't know what the prohibition was, or you knew there was a prohibition, but you didn't know this counted as that prohibition, or any other number of other ways that you can make a mistake, then you have violated Shabbat, you should learn. And in the ancient world, there were sin offerings that you could bring to make restitution for this, but you would not be subject to the death penalty. Again, the only way you would actually be subject to the earthly court death penalty was to have somebody, two witnesses there. They would have to have warned you. You would have had to acknowledge the warning, and you would have had to do it anyway, which is, as always, a very high bar before people start getting executed. When they talk about people who transgress Shabbat, there is only one case in the entire Bible where somebody who transgresses Shabbat is executed. Even though we have explicit statements of people transgressing Shabbat in later sections of trying to do two words at once, one Hebrew, one English, of ketuvim, of the writings, even though we have examples of people, whole categories of people who are bringing stuff in and out of the city on Shabbat, the solution is not kill them all. The solution is lock the doors of the city. And then the merchants won't be doing this. So it's clear that in later years, executing people for Shabbat violations was not the way it was done. And we'll talk about summary execution for other crimes later. What I mean is, if you see somebody actually doing the crime, there are certain crimes you get to execute them for on the spot, and certain crimes you don't get to execute them for. Just as a case of example, if you see someone trying to murder another person, you are allowed to stop them even at the cost of their life. Shabbat is on the other side. You do not get to stop someone from violating Shabbat at the expense of their life. Okay, make sense? Maybe? That was a long explanation for one sentence. Second sentence?
Oh, it was me, yes.
Yes.
I was doing something else. One who curses his father or his mother is not punished unless he curses them by the divine name. If he cursed them by a nickname, Rabbi Meir held him liable, but the sages ruled that he is exempt.
Okay, so Rabbi Meir says, yes, if he uses a nickname, this is also a problem, and the other sages said no. As we mentioned before about blasphemy, when it comes to the special category of cursing one's parents, cursing them means to literally use the divine name, the ineffable name of God, against them. Anything less than that is rude, horrible, and you absolutely should be going to bed without your supper, but is not liable for the death penalty, where the Torah talks about those who curse their parents are punished by death. So again, it narrows and restricts the application of the death penalty that someone might have thought, if they were just reading the Torah all on their lonesome without any additional help or explanation, they would have thought, hey, you know what, if I say, F you to my dad, then that means I'm liable for the death penalty. And the sages say, no, it does not. And again, since we don't know the pronunciation for God's name in the modern world, no matter how much someone may swear at their parents, no one is guilty of the death penalty for doing so. They're just really, really, really rotten kids. Questions? Oh, guys, all your questions dried up. We need to get Natan back in here. He always has more questions. All right, 7-9.
7-9. 1. He who has sexual relations with a betrothed young woman is not punished until she is a young woman, a virgin betrothed and in her father's house.
Okay. Yeah. No. So let's make sure that we get this clear. So there is a special category of adultery where you are not just sleeping with someone else's wife, you are sleeping with someone else's wife who has been betrothed but not consummated as a wife. And in order for that special category for which you are stoned, regular adultery, you're just strangled, you have to meet all of these criteria. Right? She has to still be a virgin, she has to be betrothed, or else it's not adultery, and she has to still be in her father's house, and she has to be a young woman. So unless you meet those criteria, it's wrong, and there are other types of penalties, but it is not a capital offense. Make some sense?
That sentence, the betrothed young woman is not punished until she is a young woman.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's very confusing. Unless you're putting it together with the rest of it, then okay, fine then.
Right. Well, that's why there's the comma sequence.
So it's all of those. So
Exactly.
It's defining all of that together.
Exactly. It's saying a betrothed young woman. If you look in the commentary at the bottom, it explains the original quote from Deuteronomy. In the case of a virgin who is betrothed to a man, if a man comes upon her in town and lies with her, you shall take the two of them out and stone them. If it's outside the town where she knew she couldn't have gotten help, that's why it's considered a death penalty. So they take all of that together and they say every part of that sentence matters. And that is what we are going to use as our criteria for the application of this law. So here,
also, I think they say a young woman defined somebody that is less than 13, 12, 12.
no, literally that window.
Yeah.
Not less than, more than, only that.
Specifically, yeah.
Correct. So the sages were very interested in making sure this particular category was a narrow window. And this comes back with a vengeance when we start talking about the case of a Ben Sorero Morer, the rebellious son, where again, it has to be only within a narrow window. A child too young to be responsible for their actions can't count, and an adult son is too old to be considered this category. So there's a very narrow window where this can happen.
So she's 11 and a half when this happens. So he doesn't get punished until she turns 12?
No, this is 12 and a
I
half.
understand, but what if she was 11?
So this
It's so specific. So what if she's 11 and betrothed and a virgin and then living in her father's house?
then he would be strangled, not stoned. Exactly. Well, remember, we talked about the idea that different levels of punishment were considered important.
So it's worse when she's 12 and a half than when she's 11.
Because the Torah itself seems to imply that this particular situation is a more severe crime, and therefore
Maybe
they
12 and a half.
exactly.
she's
Well,
more aware.
all of this coming together. So the Torah, and again, the Torah, we might argue that even younger would be worse. Unlikely that she would necessarily be betrothed, depending upon the culture at the time. Sometimes they would do the betrothal very, very young, even though the consummation would wait until they were much older. But the idea wasn't just to say this is more severe, this is less severe, let's attach a punishment that we think fits. The idea was, how does the Torah describe it? And since the Torah goes out of its way to use this phrase, a young woman, rather than just virgin or betrothed woman, then they said we have to make sure we define young woman clearly. And their definition of young woman is the 12 and a half. Like I said, this is the idea that 12 and a half is this window is argued in other sections of the Mishnah. They don't present that argument here, but it is debated extensively of how they get to that window.
Well, there must be something culturally going on that this particular situation happens that they've got to specify what's up with punishments.
Well, the Torah certainly thought it was necessary to specify. And that's why the sages went, okay, if the Torah is specifying this unique situation, then we have to apply the law in this unique situation. Even if we think maybe younger might be worse, or we might think older is worse, or some other thing might be equal, the Torah spells it out slightly differently, so we have to adjudicate differently. That's the idea of taking the Torah's lead rather than just doing what seems good to me today. And then the interesting case that follows.
If two men had sexual relations with her, the first is stoned, but the second is strangled.
All right, so this is a very unfortunate and gruesome logic puzzle. If you need all of those conditions before the person is stoned for the act, then the first man that is with her meets all those criteria. The second man, she is no longer a virgin. She is still betrothed, she is still young, she is still everything else that makes this prohibited, so he is still executed. But since she is no longer a virgin, because the first man was already there, then the punishment for the second man is different.
And she's also stoned or strangled accordingly.
If she were a willing participant.
Yeah.
right? If she were a willing participant. If she was an unwilling participant, and there is a much longer debate about how you ascertain that, but the Torah gives us the general rule that if she was in a place where she could call for help and didn't, then we assume she was willing. And if she was in a place where if she had called for help, no help would have come, then we assume that she was unwilling as long as she says, I was unwilling. We take her word for it. So yes, if she was willing, then she receives the same punishment. If she was unwilling, then nothing happens to her. And the Torah is very explicit about that. There's no such thing as an honor killing, where a woman has been defiled against her will, but you go ahead and punish her anyway.
It sounds like that in the first sentence, though.
Which first sentence?
Well, if a man comes upon her in town, lies with her, you shall take the two of them out to the gate, and that town is stoned.
Right. So the term that's used there that the Mishnah explains is that the in town matters, because the rest of that section talks about what happens when it's out of the town. And it goes into explicit detail that it says, because she called for help and there was no one to answer her. And so the rabbis, of course, make a big deal out of that. And they say, if she were in town, then someone would have come had she asked for help. And they go into more detail of what constitutes being able to call for help and the presumption of help that being at hand and all of that. But that's the underlying principle, that if she's in a position where she could have called for help, where help would have arrived, then we assume that she was unwilling as long as she says, I was unwilling. If they're meeting for a date, then that's a different issue.
Since you asked for questions.
Yes.
This is a judicial system set up based on the Torah.
Correct.
How can we say that today's judicial system is better?
We can't. And indeed, that's.
But then you would argue that punishing someone for violating the Sabbath in this way is correct.
Excellent question. So the Torah says those who violate Shabbat are to be executed. We hold that the Torah's basic propositions are, of course, true and right, and are trying to lead us towards a better world and a better life individually, and a better life, world to come, etc. How it was considered to be applied by the sages, not necessarily by some of the more passionate speakers in the modern world, but by our sages from 2,000 years ago and on, is exactly as described, which is for someone to be worthy of execution at the hands of the community, the bar is set extremely high, such that the person is committing the crime not just because they are committing the crime, but they are committing the crime as a knowing act of refuting everything that the community is using to build itself to be a better community for. Right? Murder is the most obvious case where most of us can see someone who commits murder isn't just killing that person, they are killing a part of us all. And therefore, we as an all have a vested interest in making sure that doesn't happen. I know as a modern American, it's a little bit harder to think sometimes in that way because we tend to think of ourselves as being strict individualists. If it doesn't bother me, then I don't care what you're doing. But both in modern sociological, psychological, anthropological research, as well as ancient theology, that doesn't really hold water. There are ramifications for what others do, even if they are not directly impinging upon a victim. So the idea of blasphemy or of Shabbat violation, which we might think of as victimless crimes, our tradition does not. It says, no, this is having an effect upon us all. And therefore, we have a vested interest in deterring this from happening, of stopping this from happening. But that interest is balanced by the individual in the sense that the only way we can be sure that what you are doing is deliberately an attempt, not just to write on Shabbat, but an attempt to upturn, overthrow, and destroy our community and what we believe, is if you acknowledge that under warning and do it anyway. So what the rabbis have tried to make clear by this whole system is actually something that is more radical than what we do in the modern judicial system. In the modern judicial system, we don't care whether the person murdered someone because they wanted to overturn society. All we care is, did they do it? Yes, they did it. Did they, do it with a certain motivation? Yes, they did. They really didn't like the person, and it was definitely premeditated. And if they did it against certain categories of people, as a hate crime or killing police officers in most states, then we're even more likely to execute them in retaliation. And that's it. And we can do it on any level of evidence that we are reasonably sure, beyond a reasonable doubt, that they committed it. We're okay executing them. Judaism says no. If someone kills another person in a fit of passion and there are no witnesses, then absolutely we can punish them. And that becomes a much more complicated question of how you punish someone when you're sure they did it, but you don't have the witnesses to execute them. But we can't say what they did was a deliberate act to upend and destroy all of society. What they did was a panicked, passionate, or even premeditated act against this one person, not against us all. And so execution can't be leveled against them. So although it may look like we're killing people left, right, and center, in fact, the bar has been raised considerably that the only way we kill them was when we are sure that what they're doing isn't just a bad act, but it is an attempt at treason against us all.
That I get when maybe I'm stepping on toes here, but
Go ahead.
It seems to be,
I got thick shoes.
If you follow this, it seems like you have to argue in favor of a theocracy, and therefore jettison a lot of modern philosophical ideas.
Yes and no. So there are certain philosophical ideas of modern society that yes, the notion of radical atomic individualism, where I am unaffected by anything that doesn't directly impinge upon me and my immediate rights. Yes, that absolutely needs severe modification under this rule. The idea of democracy is perfectly compatible, because what the rabbis suggested and what they practiced was that the adjudication and the implementation of these rules required debate, discussion, and participation by not only those who were appointed by their learning and scholarship, but also were recognized by the community as being fit for that leadership position. So there was a form of consent by the ruled and of a constant feedback mechanism to ensure that this was not a theocracy in the sense of a dictatorship, or a theocracy in the sense that it was ruled by an unflinching and inflexible priestly class. This was a living, breathing judicial system, and continued throughout every place where we were allowed to implement it to be so.
So when we say America is based on Judeo-Christian principles,
it is partly true. It is partly true. It's not 100% true because of the Christo part.
But there is
a great room for compatibility. And not to step on other people's toes, many aspects of the Jewish legal system, in my mind, America has only recently caught up to, and in some cases, America is still struggling to catch up to. The notion of what evidentiary requirements there are for taking a life. I think America still isn't quite there yet. The willingness to execute on circumstantial evidence still bugs me. The willingness to execute based upon faulty defense still bothers me. I prefer the notion, at least in theory, of having the judges be the ones that are truly debating the evidence before them, rather than having trial by combat. But I mean having lawyers. That was something I learned as a young man watching the O.J. Simpson trial, where he who hires the best sword or the fastest draw or the smartest lawyer is able to purchase a different outcome than the person who can't. And when we see people who are being inadequately defended, still being executed or sentenced to horribly punitive jail sentences, that is very problematic and something that this system was designed to avoid. So Yes, there are certain sensibilities that take some definite adjustment, and some that I hope we will finally catch up to at some point.
Were you still out there in California when O.J. Simpson?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, I remember the whole white Bronco car chase on TV and all of that.
All of the attorneys were my clients.
Oh.
And the first person on the scene was never, ever, ever mentioned in the news. It was a black police officer.
I didn't know that.
And nobody knows that.
Right.
But they all knew it. It's what you say, like it's like so compelling because it was, I mean, everyone knew. I mean, the whole, like that inner peace changed so significantly. I was just like, that happened in Brentwood and I was working in Bel Air. So it was just, I mean, it was just right down the hill. So
Right.
there was just so much. I was in this little teeny enclave with these, you know, really movie stars and
Right.
all those attorneys and they, you know, that world. And that community spoke different about
What happened.
So,
Yeah, I lived in Bel Air for a few years.
did you live in
Well,
Bel Air? Yeah.
I was at rabbinic school. I lived on campus at the University of Judaism.
Oh, okay.
So
you
it was a
were there.
Mulholland address
Oh, yeah,
in my
it was
tiny
really
little
good.
apartment.
So I was up in the Beverly Glen neighborhood. Actually, it's called Bel Air, but it was like that.
Yep, I know exactly where you mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, it is a really good question, and one of the things we see, and maybe we'll see where we were. Yeah, we'll probably wrap it up with this. One of the things we see in the modern world is a lot of confusion about these points. Many people who advocate for a restoration of Torah Judaism, of the re-implementation of Torah law, halakha, with an actual Beit-Din system that has coercive power. And I'm not using coercive in the negative sense, just coercive meaning they have bailiffs and they have police and they have the ability to levy fines. Many of the people who advocate for that most strongly are not advocating for the world of the Mishnah. They are advocating for a vision where they will get to tell people what to do. And everyone will have to do it. There was a recent attempt to reconstitute a Sanhedrin. I can't remember, maybe 5-10 years ago, where basically they got together their 70 friends and said, okay, we're the new Sanhedrin because these are rabbis that everybody agrees are the great rabbis. And everyone outside of that group said, I don't agree with you. There is within Judaism the idea that the Sanhedrin can be reconstituted by the consent of the community. Surprise, surprise, the community has not consented to reconstitute the Sanhedrin. They claimed they had, and they were going to start issuing new edicts that would make all sorts of things clearly prohibited because people were doing things that they shouldn't be doing, in their opinion, and no one listens to them except themselves. And therefore, they argue even more strongly, this is exactly why we need to have force and be able to implement our will, because no one's listening to us. But when you read the Mishnah, and especially when you read the accounts throughout Jewish history of what it meant to bring Torah law to a community, it meant that the community worked with the scholars, both because they yearned for living in a world that was governed by Torah, that would create a good and just society, and because they wanted to make sure Torah law matched life. There was no ivory tower. Yes, you would study, and you would often go away to study for a period and return, but you lived in the community, you had a job yourself, and you were practical. You understood what life was, and you weren't some mullah or a bishop far removed that was passing fatwas and edicts. And you had to, most importantly, show your work. That is to say, any rabbi for the last 2,000 years who wanted to say such and such is prohibited or such and such is permitted had to show the rationalization, the steps of their thinking, in order that it was open for what we would now call peer review. And that was a very important step. And there are many stories within the Talmud and other literature where rabbis would come in, new guy in the street, and he had his 6 guns, and I'm going to clean up this town. And the people would say, we don't like him. And it didn't matter what his credentials were. It didn't matter how erudite he was. If the community would not accept him, out he went. Other places, you get whole courts that would lay down new laws that say we need to do this from now on in order to be right. And the people would say, we can't live like that. The law you have told us to pass is too strict. We can't live under that circumstance. And so the rabbis would say, all right, then we revoke the law. Then we will have to find another way to make this work. So it does have a lot to offer itself.
Can I ask you a question? What is the difference between a
living within the United States, where it is not a homogenous society, where it is not one where I would expect Judaism to dictate to everyone else what to do. I can't say that I hope the US becomes a Jewish state. Wouldn't mind if there were a few more Jews, but certainly I do hope at some point the world will come to recognize that there is more justice and more compassion and more humanity in laws that are truly derived from an understanding of God than the people who blow themselves up and murders others would let you believe. So much has been done over the last 1,000 years to give religion a bad name and to tarnish God with the blood of thousands, that it's hard sometimes to explain and to look people in the eye and say, if we just followed Torah, things would be better, because it sounds too similar to the people that are committing these atrocities. But there is a fundamental difference. As you can see, nowhere in here are you grabbing people and beheading them in the street. Nowhere in here are you killing children in their beds. Nowhere in here are you driving a truck down the middle of a crowded road. None of that happens. And that's the difference when you truly study looking for the goodness that God wants for the world, rather than studying or acting because you are angry at the world and you want God to punish all the people you're angry at. Which we'll have to hold in mind as we get to 7:10 next week, because we'll be talking about the people who are worshiping idols and the people who are trying to seduce others to worship idols. Which maybe as a little bit of an aside, you might want to look up what idolatry was like in the meantime, and meditate a little bit on the inherent poison and exploitation and corruption that comes from idolatry. That as soon as you have a god that is contained within an item, then the god becomes subject to human control, and that means those who are in control of the object are in control of the rest of the people. It is an inherently degrading and exploitative system, and that is fundamentally why God opposes it. It's not just that God can't stand statues. It's God understands what idolatry represents as a threat to the natural human condition and the proper path for our spirits. So bear that in mind when we deal with all of the severe repercussions of idolatry next week.